Hi everyone and welcome to episode 4 of I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. The story we are reading in the collection is the first story. It's called Robbie and it's about a friendship between a young girl called Gloria and her pet robot. Most recently, the Westons have moved to New York because Mrs. Weston felt that taking her daughter away would allow her to forget about Robbie. Unfortunately, things haven't quite worked out like that. Mr. Struthers was a conscientious general manager and naturally inclined to be a bit talkative. The combination therefore resulted in a tour that was fully explained, perhaps even over-abundantly explained at every step. However, Mrs. Weston was not bored. Indeed, she stopped him several times and begged him to repeat his statements in simpler language so that Gloria might understand. Under the influence of this appreciation of his narrative powers, Mr. Struthers expanded genially and became ever more communicative, if possible. John Watson himself showed a gathering impatience. Pardon me, Struthers, he said, breaking into the middle of a lecture on the photoelectric cell. Haven't you a section on the factory where only robot labour is employed? Yes, indeed. He smiled at Mrs. Weston. A vicious circle in a way, robots creating more robots. Of course, we are not making a general practice out of it. For one thing, the unions would never let us. But we can turn out a very few robots using robot labour exclusively, merely as a sort of scientific experiment. You see, he tapped his pince-nez into one palm, argumentatively. What the labour unions don't realise, and I say this as a man who has always been very sympathetic with the labour movement in general, is that the advent of the robot, while involving some dislocation to begin with, will inevitably... Yes, Struthers, said Weston, but about that section of the factory you speak of, may we see it? It would be very interesting, I'm sure. Yes, of course. Mr. Struthers replaced his pince-nez in one conclusive moment and gave vent to a soft cough of discomfiture. Follow me, please. He was comparatively quiet while leading the three through a long corridor and down a flight of stairs. Then, when they had entered a large, well-lit room that buzzed with metallic activity, the sluices opened and the flood of explanation poured forth again. There you are, he said with a pride in his voice. Robots only. 5 men act as overseers and they don't even stay in this room. In 5 years, that is, since we began this project, not a single accident has occurred. Of course, the robots here assembled are comparatively simple, but... The general manager's voice had long died to a rather soothing murmur in Gloria's ears. The whole trip seemed rather dull and pointless to her, though there were many robots in sight. None were even remotely like Robbie, though, and she surveyed them with open contempt. In this room there weren't any people at all, she noticed. Then her eyes fell upon 6 or 7 robots busily engaged at a round table halfway across the room. They widened in incredulous surprise. It was a big room. She couldn't see for sure, but one of the robots looked like... It was Robbie! Her shriek pierced the air, and one of the robots about the table faltered and dropped the tool he was holding. Gloria went almost mad with joy. Squeezing through the railing before either parent could stop her, she dropped lightly to the floor a few feet below and ran towards her Robbie, arms waving and hair flying. And the 3 horrified adults, as they stood frozen in their tracks, saw what the excited little girl did not see. A huge, lumbering tractor bearing blindly down upon its appointed track. It took split seconds for Weston to come to his senses, and those split seconds meant everything, for Gloria could not be overtaken. Although Weston vaulted the railing in a wild attempt, it was obviously hopeless. Mr. Struthers signalled widely to the overseers to stop the tractor, but the overseers were only human, and it took time to act. It was only Robbie that acted immediately and with precision. With metal legs eating up the space between himself and his little mistress, he charged down from the opposite direction. Everything then happened at once. With one sweep of an arm, Robbie snatched up Gloria, slackening his speed not one iota and consequently knocking every breath of air out of her. Weston, not quite comprehending all that was happening, fell rather than saw Robbie brush past him and come to a sudden, bewildered halt. The tractor intersected Gloria's path half a second after Robbie had rolled on 10 feet further and came to a grinding, long, drawn-out stop. Gloria regained her breath, submitted to a series of passionate hugs on the part of both her parents, and turned eagerly towards Robbie. As far as she was concerned, nothing had happened except that she had found her friend. But Mrs. Weston's expression had changed from one of relief to one of dark suspicion. She turned to her husband and, despite her dishevelled and undignified appearance, managed to look quite formidable. "You engineered this, didn't you?" George Weston swabbed at a hot forehead with his handkerchief. His hand was unsteady, and his lips would curve only into a tremulous and exceedingly weak smile. Mrs. Weston pursued the thought. Robbie wasn't designed for engineering or construction work. He couldn't be of any use to them. You had him placed there deliberately so that Gloria would find him. You know you did. Well, I did, said Weston. But Grace, how was I to know the reunion would be so violent? And Robbie has saved her life. You'll have to admit that. You can't send him away again. Grace Weston considered. She turned toward Gloria and Robbie and watched them abstractedly for a moment. Gloria had a grip about the robot's neck and would have asphyxiated any creature but one of metal, and was prattling nonsense in half-hysterical frenzy. Robbie's chrome steel arms, capable of bending a bar of steel 2 inches in diameter into a pretzel, wound about the little girl gently and lovingly, and his eyes glowed a deep, deep red. "Well," said Mrs. Weston at last, "I guess he can stay with us until he rusts." Susan Calvin shrugged her shoulders. Of course he didn't. That was 1998. By 2002 we had invented the mobile speaking robot, which of course made all the non-speaking models out of date and which seemed to be the final straw as far as the non-robot elements were concerned. Most of the world governments banned robot use on Earth for any purpose other than scientific research between 2003 and 2007. So that Gloria had to give up Robbie. That Gloria had to give up Robbie eventually. I'm afraid so. I imagine, however, that it was easier for her at her age of 15 than at 8. Still, it was a stupid and unnecessary attitude on the part of humanity. US robots hit its low point financially just about the time I joined them in 2007. At first I thought my job might come to a sudden end in a matter of months, but then we simply developed the extraterrestrial market. And then you were set, of course. Not quite. We began by trying to adapt the models we had on hand, those first speaking models, for instance. They were about 12 feet high, very clumsy, and not much good. We sent them out to Mercury to help build a mining station there, but they failed. I looked up in surprise. It did? Why? Mercury Mines is a multi-billion-dollar concern. It is now, well, it was the second attempt that succeeded. If you want to know about that young man, I'll advise you to look up Gregory Powell. He and Michael Donovan handled our most difficult cases in the teens and 20s. I haven't heard from Donovan in years, but Powell is living right here in New York. He's a grandfather now, which is a thought difficult to get used to. I can only think of him as a rather young man, of course. Of course, I was younger too. I tried to keep her talking. If you would give me the bare bones, Dr. Calvin, I can have Mr. Powell fill it in afterward. And this is exactly what I later did. She spread her thin hands out upon the desk and looked at them. There are 2 or 3, she said, that I know a little about. Start with Mercury, I suggested. Well, I think it was in 2015 that the second Mercury expedition was sent out. It was exploratory and financed in part by US robots and in part by Solar Minerals. It consisted of a new type robot, still experimental. Gregory Powell, Michael Donovan. Okay, so that's a little bit of a teaser, isn't it? So we came to the end of this story about Gloria and Robbie, and at the end we had this little exchange of dialogue between 2 characters, one of whom we know is Susan Calvin, but the second one we don't know, but it is described as a first-person narrator by the use of the I. It neatly segues, I think, into the next story. So that was the end of Robbie, and then it ends with this mention of Gregory Powell and Michael Donovan and the mission to Mercury. So tomorrow we will begin with the second story called A Runaround. Okay, everyone, have a great day, a great evening, and I will be back tomorrow with the second story.